We will have two parts on this session. The first one looking at the improving performance in irrigation, how we measure this improvement of performance. And the idea is we really have to have this change of behavior where we think about irrigation as a service. The same way water utilities are thinking about it, we really have to have this change in looking at the sector, etc. And the second part, which is also something that's very dear to my heart and a lot of my colleagues, is the farmer-led irrigation development. This is really the fastest growing irrigation, type of irrigation, and really give us this idea of going out of this government-led irrigation versus private-led irrigation. I think we need both. It's the same way as saying, do we do irrigation or rain-fed agriculture? We should do both. We should do everything that we need to get every drop of water give us the food security. So I've been in my role as a global lead on the water in agriculture at the World Bank since July. And really those two thematics is where I see a lot of demands from our client countries, asking how do I know that I'm getting the best productivity on water? And of course, there's debate on what we call productivity of the water. Is that the ultimate goal? And then you have the water saving, etc. Or to say we have all these areas, for example, in the Sahel, where you still have opportunities to develop irrigation. In Africa, there's still a lot of opportunities. How can we do it faster than we have done in the past? Because simply we have to develop this resilience to the climate change and food security. So we'll start with the first presentation, which is a recorded video from our colleague Jonathan Denison on irrigation operator of the future. So remember that, because I think this is really a concept that we're really seeing more and more getting interest from our clients. If we can start the video.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Jonathan Denison, and I'll be presenting an overview of the Irrigation Operator of the Future Toolkit on behalf of the wider team led by Amal Talbi
Wait
and
for
Peter
the right
Varley.
video.
So the Irrigation Operator of the Future Toolkit was developed over the last 18 months by a team from the World Bank. Greetings, everyone. I'm Jonathan Denison, and I'll be presenting an overview of the Irrigation Operator of the Future Toolkit on behalf of the wider team led by Amal Talbi and Peter Varley. So the Irrigation Operator of the Future Toolkit was developed over the last 18 months by a team from the World Bank and AFAID, through the French Association of Utilities. We're all acutely aware of the global shifts in water availability due to cross-sectoral, climate, demographic, and land use changes, with major impact on irrigation and water availability. Resource changes are further compounded by the geopolitical impacts on global food supplies and food sovereignty that demand new ways of working. Also, in the last decade, we see a resurgence of interest in irrigation development from many international financing institutions and governments, both in irrigation expansion, particularly in Africa where resources are still available, and more widely in improving the performance of schemes. The latter, scheme operations, is where the IOF has application. Yeah, it's interesting that the published work of more than 20 years ago by the likes of Burton, Burt, and Pruskela, among others, on a service delivery approach has become mainstream, as most governments now strive to transfer the cost of operations and maintenance onto water users. This confluence of demand for operational streamlining and scheme financial sustainability lies at the core of the IOF working context, because operators are being asked to perform better with less water, declining infrastructure condition, and less public financing. So the toolkit can be described as a combination of a participative process of engagement involving an IOF facilitator and the operator's team, and a guiding set of knowledge on organizational change trajectories that combine to help the operator assess performance, define priority problems, and reset the performance targets, and then arrive at taking practical action to achieve these targets. The body of work is inspired by a number of thematic works. First is the Water Services Sector Utilities of the Future Toolkit, which has been proven over 15 years, mainly for urban water supplies. The Governance in Irrigation and Drainage Workbook, which emphasizes multiple perspectives on performance and a service delivery approach. The excellent and well-established work by FAO and others on irrigation performance assessment techniques. And finally, the problem-driven iterative adaptation approach to governance reform from Harvard. The last of these is an important addition to the body of irrigation performance work because we know from experience that change management, even when it's brilliant and effective technical interventions, are likely to achieve very little without deep-seated ownership of the change interventions. And that organizational reflexivity is critical to survival in a highly dynamic operational environment. The IOF is intended for global application with an emphasis on developing countries. The target operators are those who employ professional staff managing schemes of a few thousand hectares or more. The toolkit knowledge set contains guiding information across operations, maintenance, and financial and commercial management, and human resources. It also includes information on growth trajectories in relation to asset and environmental management. There are a range of peripheral functions that operators often undertake that are not included in the current scope of functions. Things like land administration, water support services, domestic water supply, and agricultural services. These are not yet included, but are earmarked for the future. Avoiding too much theoretical diversion, it is important that the complex operational environment is captured in a dynamic systems view, but it is then addressed in a manageable way through engagement with two main working instruments, if you like, the use of indicators and of capability pathways. The complex system can be reflected by a pyramid with a legal and policy framework at the base, the operator's organization and assets in the middle, and the combined functions of these leading to a set of service delivery outcomes. Water supply to farms being central, and that then leads to agricultural and environmental outcomes that are impacted by, but are not solely attributed to the operator's performance. The indicators help answer, how are we performing? The top half of the pyramid. And the capability pathways help give guidance on what can we do to function better. So the question is, how does this all unfold? The facilitated engagement process takes place over two one-week sessions in round 1 and round 2, followed by a virtual engagement in round 3. The approach draws heavily on the operator's own insights and experience. In most cases, operational experience on large-scale irrigation scheme extends many decades, often back into colonial times. The IOF process doesn't intend to replicate the performance benchmarking approaches of other well-established tools, but it rather aims to unlock the wealth of local experience and knowledge, to identify root causes of low performance, and then augment local knowledge with technical, digital, and organizational innovations to inspire new strategic responses, both short-term and long-term. In round 1, the emphasis is on using performance indicators to help understand the nature and severity of the problems. There are at least 50 possible key indicators in the literature that we whittle down to a more manageable 18 in number. The indicators are grouped in relation to 4 spatial scales. There's the farm scale, the scheme boundary itself, then the organizational boundary, and finally, the wider boundary, which is upstream and downstream of the scheme. Performance data is obtained from all possible sources. This can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, and it can be remote sensing. Piloting showed us that it is essential to bring useful, thought-provoking information to the table at the start, and using desktop remote sensing outputs covered in detail by my colleague Pulad Karimi has been an important discussion starter. Performance scoring outputs are generated graphically and then feed into the critical discussions on problem identification. In round 2, the emphasis is on organizational capability progression, where capability is defined as the combination of the organizational behaviors, structures, skills, tools, and influence, leading to what Amartya Sen called the freedom to act. Capability pathways are developed across 5 organizational development stages, from developing to innovating. And for each of these 5, these cover each of the 5 main elements of the organization, and also the external policy and legal environment. Once the priority problems and root causes are identified in round 1, then in round 2, these are matched to topics from the toolkit, comprising 117 capability pathways, which extend across these 5 organizational domains and the external environment. The focus on the topics and capability pathways is an experience-based knowledge set that simply prompts discussion on what an improvement in the organizational development to achieve the new goals might involve. So, for example, at management of water shortages, water resources may not be monitored intake, but the intention is to monitor water resource levels and have them managed at scheme level. Or within the spreadsheet, if we just lift out one topic on canals, flow measurement equipment, you can see in the developing stage, there's no flow measurement equipment. It goes through time-based registration, then to depth measurement, and then more sophisticated measurement structures, and finally electronic measurement. And what we're seeing in the pilots is particular interest in moving to this advancing and innovating stage, mainly because of the need to link service delivery standards to service level agreements. The final stage, round 3, is around options analysis and strategic plans, and the development of 100-day and 5-year action plans. And there we look at authority, acceptance, and ability of the plans in order to establish what is practical. Moving to closure, then the IOF toolkit comprises a written process guide and a body of guiding knowledge in interactive Excel form that can be used by IOF facilitators after a few days of training. The whole idea is that this is not a toolkit reserved for technical experts, but that it becomes a routine part of irrigation governance and management interventions undertaken by consultants and or government teams. Finally, then, the IOF has been rolling out with partial piloting in Georgia, Albania, and Tajikistan, and now full piloting in Kenya, with the training of a government IOF facilitator team to take place in May. As takeaways, the IOF is a toolkit that enables facilitated performance self-assessment, the definition of change pathways, arriving at actionable 100-day plans, and a 5-year strategic investment plan. If you're interested in working with the IOF, please contact Amal Talbi at the email below. Thanks very much. Greetings, everyone. I'm Jonathan Dennison, and I'll be presenting an overview
use of the remote sensing.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And my name is IJsbrand de Jong. I'm a lead water resources specialist with the World Bank, based in Indonesia, previously based in India and in Central Asia, and working on Africa. I've been with the World Bank for over 23 years and working in the field of irrigation, in particular the governance of irrigation. Today, I would like to talk to you about irrigation service delivery, the quality of the services and how we can improve it, and a few recent developments in how we can improve the quality of irrigation services and how we can make irrigation agencies more accountable for their performance. And I would like to start my presentation with the vicious cycle of poor irrigation services, inadequate funds, inadequate operation and maintenance of infrastructure, and unwillingness to pay by farmers for these poor services. This is a cycle that we are all familiar with, and it's not limited to irrigation. It's typical for many other services, including water supply, transport, and other services in our client countries. The fundamental problem that I see in irrigation is that irrigation service providers are not held accountable for the performance for the services that they provide. And the thing that we have learned in resolving this challenge is that we cannot break the vicious cycle by raising tariffs. So we cannot start on the left-hand side of this cycle. We have to start on the right-hand side of the cycle. We have to start by improving the quality of services, and then we can later on increase the cost recovery in payment for these services. Why is irrigation service delivery so important? And I think there are a number of reasons why that is the case. In the first place, we have to consider that water is an input into an agricultural production system. And farmers can freely choose their inputs, but for some reason they cannot freely choose the water supply. Water supply is often provided in a very top-down manner. And water is a critical input as it provides an incentive for farmers to use other inputs and to intensify and diversify agricultural production. Reliable water, good quality of irrigation services can really be a driver for poverty reduction. The importance of reliable water is that farmers who start producing for markets often invest in a secure access to water first. And I would like to share with you a graph that comes from a study that we did in India. On the horizontal axis, you see the distance from the head of the canal, and on the vertical axis, you see the agricultural productivity in the dry season. And what you see here is that, contrary to popular belief, many people believe that the agricultural productivity is highest in the top end of an irrigation system. What we see here is that agricultural productivity is actually highest in the tail end of an irrigation system. And the explanation for that is that in tail end parts of an irrigation system, farms actually use groundwater and they use pumps. And the quality of irrigation service delivery of these pumps is much better than canal water. And so what we see here in this graph is, in a way, the agricultural productivity against the quality of irrigation services. And there are a couple of new developments in irrigation service delivery that I would like to discuss with you. And we will also hear during this session from colleagues who will speak more in detail about some of these initiatives. But one of the initiatives that we have recently launched, that the World Bank has recently launched, is the Irrigation Utility of the Future tool. It's based on the Water Supply Utility of the Future tool, and it is adapted for irrigation service delivery. The tool provides an opportunity for self-assessment of the performance of irrigation service providers along 4 groups of performance functions: the water delivery performance, the organizational performance, governance performance, and agricultural and environmental performance. A second new development in irrigation services that I would like to share with you is the Inspire platform. Again, it is something that has come from the water supply sector, where several platforms exist whereby utility managers come together and share their experience and share their lessons learned. Inspire is a platform that brings together irrigation managers and that provides an opportunity for irrigation managers to share their experience and to share lessons learned and hopefully learn from each other in an effort to improve the quality of irrigation services. And the last development that I would like to share with you that is important for improving the quality of irrigation services is the use of remote sensing for performance assessment. Now, remote sensing has been with us for quite a while, at least for 20 years, and we all have these colorful maps on our walls with red and yellow and orange that indicate the level of evapotranspiration from an irrigation system. But the problem I'm having with these maps, with the early use of remote sensing for irrigation performance assessment, is that it wasn't really very operational. If you're an irrigation manager and you're facing challenges of water supply, water delivery, then the early maps of remote sensing weren't very useful, weren't really helping you improve the quality of your irrigation services. And so we undertook a study in India where we identified 10 irrigation performance indicators that can all be measured through remote sensing. And I just want to give two examples here. The equitable use, the uniform use of water. So this through remote sensing, we measure the water consumption uniformity across space. Can be a plot, can be a canal, can be a command area, can be a province, and even a country. And across time. And so we use the coefficient of variation of the evapotranspiration across the spatial units of the area of study, and we can do that by season, annual, and monthly. And that is a powerful indicator of how uniform the consumption of within an irrigation system is, and everything staying the same. In particular, when you talk about rice irrigation systems, then it is also a proxy indicator for the quality of the supply, the uniformity of the supply. And the other indicator that I just wanted to share with you is the water savings potential, which is the difference in the consumptive water use between farms in the same area that produce the same yield under the same climatic soil conditions. So some farms you will see use a lot of water, as indicated by the evapotranspiration, and some farms that have exactly the same production level use much less water. And using these farms, these latter farms, as a standard and calculating the aggregated difference between these farms across the area of study, we can say something about the water savings potential. Now, there are other indicators that are important from an operational perspective. As I mentioned, we identified 10 of these indicators. The cropping intensity is one of them, and of course, water productivity. And so this is, in my view, this is a potential game changer in the measurement and monitoring of performance of irrigated agriculture because of the following reasons. In the first place, it is output-based. So we're not monitoring the performance of irrigation by monitoring inputs, as is often done. For example, the budget allocation of the public budget to irrigation as a performance indicator. No, these are output indicators. So we really measure the output of irrigated agriculture. It is cost effective because all these data can freely be downloaded from the internet, are open source data. It is much more reliable and accurate than the performance data that were collected by hand previously. It's surprising how difficult it is actually to measure something like irrigation efficiency. You would have to measure the flow into a field. You need measurement equipment for that. You need to do that on a real-time basis because otherwise you don't know what is happening between two measuring points. And then for the production, you need to take crop cuttings. You can only do that one per hectare or so in the best case, but and then only for a few times per season. So, and the use of remote sensing really allows us to monitor these performance indicators on a real-time basis, and we can zoom in to even the plot level to evaluate the outcome. It allows for benchmarking across canals, schemes, provinces, and countries, and we can also share these data through a smartphone app where we can. For an irrigation system, show these indicators, and as an effort to reach out to the water users and share the performance of the irrigation system with the users. There are, of course, a few complications. We need to have a shapefile of the irrigation system. The remote sensing doesn't distinguish between the different sources of water, rainwater, canal water, or groundwater. It's all the same thing. You need to do, of course, ground truthing calibration of the kind of crops that farms grow. And it is not a comprehensive performance assessment. There are many things that are related to performance, but that cannot be measured through remote sensing. So it's really a contribution to a performance assessment in a broader sense. But I think the key issue of the use of remote sensing for irrigation performance assessment is that it makes it possible to sign performance-based contracts with an operator and to outsource the irrigation management to a third party on a performance basis. And we are working in several countries on that. We in India and West Bengal, we have a project under implementation where we are doing precisely that, outsourcing of irrigation service delivery on a performance basis to a third-party operator. So what are the key takeaway messages from my presentation? In the first place, it is important to improve the quality of irrigation services because it is such an important driver for agricultural intensification and diversification, and therefore for poverty reduction. Use of remote sensing for irrigation performance assessment is a game changer because it makes it possible to outsource the irrigation management on a performance basis. Please join us to improve the accountability of irrigation service provision. We like to hear from you. We like to hear from your experience. We like to answer any questions that you have on these new developments in irrigation service delivery. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good.
To present, so Poulad Karimi will present.
Opening slide. Thank you, Mom. The opening slide? I can do that. I guess. Yeah, easy. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It seems like we have rehearsed because Jonathan and I can do that. So it looks like we have been rehearsed, but we are not, right? I mean, Jonathan and Isbrand gave such a nice opening to everything that we want to discuss in this session. But before I start talking about the presentation, I want to make a confession. This is my first, and by the way, my name is Poulad Karimi. I'm a senior irrigation specialist with the World Bank. And this is my first conference that I'm attending as a presenter after I joined the World Bank. So means that I'm presenting to a scientific community, but wearing different hat. So what basically is coming in my presentation, it's not going to be about scientific advances that we have made, right? We had a brilliant session about the advanced methods for irrigation monitoring yesterday, learning about the sensor, learning about the most advanced ways of doing a lot of these work. But the question I just want to put forward now is for, as a community, our job is now, I mean, at least my job, is to make sure this science is being used, right? How do I convince the governments? How do I get the client countries? How do I get different institutions to actually adopt this for their operation, for their decision making? And that, my friends, is a difficult one. I didn't know this. I didn't know it's difficult until I joined the bank. It is very tough because it's not just about the content. It's not about dazzling them with the beautiful map, as Isbrand said. It's about showing what is it in it for them, because they have to invest money, they have to invest time, they have to get people on board, and if they cannot deliver, if they cannot show the added value, then we are all in trouble. So listen to me with that in mind. And then I would like to also hear your thought, because that's also this is the right community to kind of get that feedback of what are your thoughts and how do we bring these things to the decision makers to make sure that they are being actually taken up. So the way we approach this, basically, I'm going to, this way, yes. So the way we are trying to actually get this remote sensing work going, as in the operations and in the projects, to kind of make an umbrella of what we call water accounting. In water accounting, we count for every drop of water, right? think about different scales. If I'm talking about a basin, then I'm thinking about maybe overall water availability, how much water is used where, and that gives me an envelope of water picture in a basin. But let's go down to the field level. In the field level, the interests are different. I'm still counting those drop of water, but the reason that I'm doing that is because of crop production. So I cannot exclude crop from that mix. Then I need to know about basically what type of crop are we talking about? What kind of land use is this? How much profit do I get from that crop? What is the basically level of the biomass production? Is the crop able to convert that water consumption to higher level of yield or not? So everything kind of comes together. And then at the end, can I benchmark this? Can I tell a client, a government, an agency, which scheme is doing better than another scheme without it being my opinion or somebody else's opinion? Can I show basically quantification of where my opinion is coming from? And that becomes a basically challenge if we don't follow a certain procedure. That's why you heard from Jonathan about the IOF, the procedure that we're trying to do for performance, and also on the application of basically remote sensing. Again, when you deal with the governments, you don't have, you don't have years. You have phases. If you get their attention at the beginning, you have a second chance. If you go big and then say, I'm going to come back in 4 years' time and give you some results, I'm sorry, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. I mean, it's not a PhD time that we usually have 4 years to come up with something sensible. So in that order, in our operation, we are dividing this. We are just doing a rapid phase of analysis, trying to raise the interest where the interest should basically is actually naturally coming. And if it doesn't come, it's okay. We move on to the next one. But if it's not a two-way engagement, it's better not to have it. So we start with this basically what we call a rapid phase of water accounting. And this is basically where we use the available global products. This is a video, and I don't know how to play it. Am I playing this?
It didn't come across as a video.
Oh, okay.
We got a video embedded in there.
Yes, it is a video, right? What we have done is basically we have used all the available, not all of it, some of the available global products in evapotranspiration, biomass, dry matter production, rainfall, to be able to create this, what we call global rapid water accounting, which kind of you delineate your area or give the basin, and then you get a report, a standard report in basically 1 or 2 minutes that gives you a kind of a full report of what we call water accounting report. It's not closing the water balance, so we are not doing magic. We're just doing spatial analysis on the existing data. And this is when you would see some such maps. So this is an example from Armenia. And this has taken me basically maybe a few minutes to produce. And then I can basically hand over this to the client and also discuss it with them to show them what they can see. Actually, they can see precipitation, how it changes, what are the areas they have higher precipitation, what are the trends through time. Then we talk about evapotranspiration, what are the zones area. This is Ararat Valley where there are a lot of irrigation activities. And then basically when you look into P minus ET, which to you is probably, very much familiar, is that where you look into the zones of use. So you see a lot of uses that exceed the basically precipitation in this area, which is an agriculture area. And then you could actually go ahead and do more with that, zoom in. You basically talk about the biomass production, what's the level, how is the water productivity, where are the areas with higher and lower water productivity, and is there water deficit within the area? There are a lot of assumptions here, like including that we are assuming all the crops are the same, but it's a good beginning. So when we actually show this, we actually can kind of convey on a broader scale what is it that we see as in the first scan. And then if and when that engagement goes to the next level, there is an interest, there is a reason to follow. There's a next part that we call water accounting deep dive. This is where we actually start doing the original data processing. This is where our methods come in. We do crop mapping, usually using machine learning, then irrigated area mapping, evapotranspiration mapping, estimating of the crop yield, go about doing the validation, and then doing the benchmarking. So this is a procedure that are doing now quite a bit in Europe and Central Asia, Georgia, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, yeah, a lot of countries, India, Armenia, and also Azerbaijan are also happening. So this is where we kind of do develop the next video, which is not going to show actually.
At least we
No.
have you in person.
No, I see.
When you embed a video, we have to know that.
Okay, no, that's okay. I'm just trying to go to the next one
Okay.
now. That's understood.
Here, I'll just do it for you.
I'll make sure that I remember that in the next conference. So, okay, this is basically a platform. So this is done in Google Earth Engine. So far it's free subscriptions, luckily. So this is where we do our crop mapping. And then this is the entire country of Georgia, right, by the way. This is a country application, national level application, where you have all the crop classification, you have the water accounting numbers, how much evapotranspiration, precipitation, biomass production, water productivity, and if the video played, you could have seen that basically you can zoom into the field level because we have used Sentinel and Landsat data, so you can use into up to 10 meter, and it works. It kind of works, so which is nice. So what we have used that for, because it's also not about having a beautiful platform, right? The ask was that the government of Georgia wants to borrow about 200 million from the bank, right? And they want to know, where do they invest this 200 million? Which is a fair question, right? I mean, we should tell them something about that. So what they came back to us, I mean, in this discussion, they gave us 20 schemes. They said, these are our 20 schemes that we have shortlisted. You see across Georgia. And then question was, can you do your performance assessment to help us select the schemes that we should focus on? So this is what Icebrand actually developed basically explained on the indicators. These are 10 indicators that are actually more operational side. So it's slightly deviation from the way we used adequacy, reliability, and equity, and there's another one, right? So we go to these because they come with an action. We can say, okay, if scheme utilization is low, that means that your actual serviced area is much less than your designed time. So it's a common thing in ex-Soviet republics, because at the Soviet time, there were like a whole irrigation scheme were functioning at the full extent. Then came the collapse, and then for many years, there was no investment in maintaining irrigation schemes. So now you go to Georgia, a scheme that used to be maybe 20,000 hectares, what is cultivated is 2,000 hectares. So that's where your scheme utilization scores quite low. I mean, yep. You see, I mean, these are scores from 1 to 10, and 10 being the highest, and 1 being the lowest. And you see across all these schemes, utilization is low. And when you actually put it in this way, and then you can also average them, you can see which schemes are scoring higher, and within which category they are scoring higher or lower. I mean, you can ask the question whether you should put your money in schemes that are not performing, or you should put your money in the schemes that are performing. I think there would be a lot more layers of information that needs to go to that decision. But in this way, you have a method for quantifying the performance, and also to pointing out, if you choose this scheme, for instance, so it's Narakavis that we actually have chosen, what do we invest in? You can break it down to the type of the basically indicator that are lower or higher. So that's how basically we are taking this to that kind of decision making. And we do this with the client, right? I mean, that is actually a workshop we had during the project, basically preparation of the project. So now you see they actually interact with it. They are quite interested. And this engagement actually ended up with the government agreeing to borrow $6 million from us to create an institution in Georgia to do this. So that is basically how that's why we have a short span of time, right? We have to do the phase 1, interest, phase 2, and then talk about how do we do this for a longer term. And hopefully we can cater this. That's a headache that I probably have for the next few years. Now that they are interested, we have to deliver, which is another something. And then you can also go bigger, right? This is a regional application that we had for Central Asia, where we actually, sometimes access to data is also a question with countries such as Turkmenistan, or where we don't get a lot of basically public data. And then basically, so, I mean, not need to say basically with remote sensing, you can actually do cross this basically boundaries. So yeah, just want to summarize that the one thing that we should really do is to stop talking about data and start talking about services. So as long as I talk about beautiful data and then nice spatial temporal resolution, if it stays as the data, I'm just not going to get funding for the future at least from anybody who's actually paying for a service. So if we change that to a service, whatever that is, that helps the government, helps the agencies to actually do what they need to do, then we have a chance of getting part of their budget, part of the allocated money for that specific activity, to sustain these kind of activities over long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pulad. And I think that's a very important point. We really work with clients, so we hear what are the questions. And I think forums like here is an opportunity to come back to the scientific community and say, these are the questions that we hear. Can you help us? And really the idea of, I would say, knowledge in implementation. How do we get that bridge? How can we fill that bridge? I will propose 5 minutes of questions before we go to the second part of this session, if there's any question.
The countries was Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. You're testing my geography now, and also my language skills. So, sure.
Please.
So I really enjoy this, like knowing that there are all those toolkits being developed or have been developed, because I'm a researcher and I'm trying to look at the agricultural production as a whole. My education is in hydrology, so I think in water volumes and whatever. But I know when we are analyzing sort of performance of irrigation, I need to think either in yield or money, and water and so on. So it's like it becomes more. So those types of toolkits are really interesting. My question is, what about resilience? What about is resilience part of the performance that you're being assessing? Because I know if we think about irrigation as a service, we need to think, oh, it's going to work for this amount of years in this situation. And I know resilience, maybe we think about more in a statistical way, the probability of the system breaking and so on, but is that part of the assessment? And second comment, because I am a modeler, I'm really interested in knowing the methods or models that you use, because I know remote sensing is just a source of data. And then you have all these pixels, is a mess, and then you clean them, make them pretty, and so on. So I wonder if there's a way to get which model, what are the calibration and validation values, if there's any sensitivity analysis and so on. That way, if we want to implement as modelers those toolkits, we have a better idea about the data and so on. So thank you.
Great points. I'll just check if there's another question, or please. The mic is coming, sorry. Okay, the mic. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. So my question is about ground truthing. And it was mentioned in previous one in your talk a little bit from two perspectives, because one, especially when you have basins that are shared between countries, you may have some of the parties who do not believe in the results of remote sensing. And then also in the first place, when you sell it to some of these communities and governments, we all have seen examples of you find one discrepancy and your users are like, this doesn't work because I know this field and this is wrong. So how do you deal with some of that to convince them?
So I'll let Pulad answer, and I'll complement on resilience, because it's a very good point.
Quickly, I mean, on the technical side of it, the modeling part, I mean, we can talk after the session. So I'm happy. So what we have done is everything we've done is open source. So we are trying, I mean, and it's also there are papers. So we are, I can share that. And also we are using a lot of basically in a crop type mapping, which is the most difficult one in a way, is we are using both supervised and unsupervised classification, and we can always talk to see how we do it. And the reason we actually do it comes back to the second one on the ground truth thing, because we have to be prepared with different situation, right? I can't start working Armenia and tell them sorry because you don't have I don't know crop specific information at the field level. I cannot deliver. So we have to be adaptable for that. So for that instance, like we do unsupervised classification, start labeling them. If we get the crop coordinate with basically good cadastral map, like we have done with Georgia, we move on to basically doing training site and supervised classification. So that part of the science that needs to be adaptive is also part of how the approach would work. Otherwise, wouldn't. On the side of basically how do the engagement happens, I think full disclosure is the best thing. I mean, some of my predecessors, they would say basically start with the beautiful one. This does everything. I rewind that. I think we just have a nice picture. Let's look at it. And if you think it's not correct, explain why. So that's that kind of engagement. And it's always about that with few months work, you cannot deliver the best work. And this has to be discussed, right? Instead of overselling. So in that order, we find people are quite amenable. So you can actually tell them this is a process. We have to take steps together. This is the first picture. And many times they appreciate it because that you take out that bit of a example, right? I mean, they see their own garden and they say, okay, this is not walnut tree. We have, I don't know, here we have apple tree. So your method is wrong. So building together, going to that step together would actually, hopefully would work.
And just to say on the irrigation operator of the future, I think what is nice is that this is presented as one of the sources of information, not as the truth, to say, from the remote sensing, this is what we see. Is it what you notice? Do you have an explanation? Where is the discrepancy and why is that? So actually, it's helpful to open a dialogue rather than say, this is the truth and if the field doesn't show that the field is wrong. No, it's really getting, and the process is as important as the result. I think it's the whole process. On the resilience, it's a very good point, and I think what we see more and more happening is for many irrigation schemes, obviously it has been designed to fail 1 year out of 10 years, maybe 1 out of 5 years. Now what's happening with long pluriannual drought is now you have schemes that are failing 4 years out of 5 years. And that's just something that's very difficult on the farmers. And part of our work actually is to have the broader water resources discussion to say, what does it mean on your water allocation? Start opening discussion to say, should we start thinking of compensation, intersectoral compensation? So I think our opportunity as a World Bank is we work with the Ministry of Water, with the Ministry of Agriculture, but also Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning. So we do have access to this higher level discussion. And I think that's why it's really great to have this exchange between our institutions. I will close the questions exceptionally. No, it's okay. It's okay, exceptionally.
Thank you. I was wondering, this methodology, of course, is very helpful, seems to be very helpful, given what you said, for rehabilitation and countries, they might need to have information. What about extending new areas of irrigation? Could it be just as useful? And if that is the case, I think that's very important to have information on the kind of crops you're going to grow, because depending on that, you're going to have information in order to have adequate dimensioning of the system and so on. So I was wondering if that is also the case, and because it would be excellently, very, very useful in that case.
No, that's actually a very good question. It is not. This doesn't do that, because for new irrigated areas, you need different criteria to kick in, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be done. So you have to think about what makes a land suitable, and also whether your water resource is enough. So you do the water balance and water counting, but to know which areas are more suitable, then you probably have to add other layers but it is doable. But I don't work in any projects so far that are about new irrigated area development, but certainly those basically could be something that
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I'm glad we took the question. We go now to the farmer-led irrigation development, first with Drigasa. And then we'll have a video. Sorry.
Okay. I hope you are not intimidated because I'm too tall.
I never had
You were standing on
Yeah, you didn't have that problem. Yes, yeah. All right. So let me quickly go to the farmer-led irrigation development discourse. I think it was a very relevant question. So globally, if we see the scope for farmer expansion is becoming more and more limited, I only heard 2 million hectares of potential. You can't hear? All right. So the only country I heard of planning to add 2 million hectares is Turkey, where I am working very intensively. So this, that's why we are also, this farmer-led irrigation development is basically, in that scope of, in areas where we have still ample possibility for expansion. So I just would like to give you a context. This farmer-led irrigation development, for those of you who worked with International Water Management Institute and also International Food Policy Research Institute, you may remember back in 2007, 2008, there was a grant fund from Gates Foundation. The idea was because it was a campaign to respond to the price spike in 2008. So there was always a panic, right? So trying to do the magic. So how can we cope with that? And so in that context, we tried to assess, the situation on the ground. So we studied extensively sub-Saharan Africa. What are the kind of agricultural water management practices that are prevailing there? One of the issues is that actually these individualized or group irrigation systems informally that are developed are really by many times, 3 to 4 times higher than the official statistics. That was the point. And then this understanding was also again complemented in 2017, right? Nick, I don't know if you were there. So there was a bank staff, a group of eminent bank staff, Steven Schomburger, and also USAID people came here and they discussed, how can we, so they talked about the experience in India. How do you think, for example, the irrigation, the overall irrigation acreage in India is actually private driven, do you know that? And yet the Indian government still has a 10-year perspective plan of developing irrigation systems. So I think there was a very conscious discussion about it. So this farmer-led irrigation development idea came in, and we have to support, we have to have a different irrigation delivery model, and that involves the users very intimately. So I just would like to talk about the virtues of irrigation. You know what irrigation is all. I think many people also know the the dirtiness of irrigation, and so always there is an extreme. So I can be fanatic environmentalist and write it off altogether, or you could be also be very moderate, and you can see the what irrigation does. Imagine if people are talking about irrigation when they say it's consuming a lot of water and it is very not sustainable. But look, imagine the East Africa, for example, the Ethiopian mountain. There is no irrigation. Still, the environment is being degraded. Farmers are scratching up the hill, and it's very erosive, and you can see. So the discussion is very important. I would like to talk about that. And then a bit about the irrigation service delivery model and the farmer-led irrigation development. And then some examples from EU, the European Union also, how they are supporting actually FLEED. Even if it is not coined as FLEED, it's a FLEED-like program there. And then I will also try to discuss about the future of FLEED. Okay, the virtues, I don't really want to go into that. So I think irrigation is really very important. It improves the productivity of land. not only of land, also the associated inputs, the kg of yield you get per kilo per gram of nitrogen or whatever phosphorus is not the same. So it improves also the productivity of associated input. So it has a productivity enhancing, food security, ensuring nutritionally also, particularly for those kind of small scale ones. It diversifies diets, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time. I would like to talk about the negative one. The negative one is that it's environmentally if not carefully managed, it can consume a lot of water, and there is no luxury, actually. There is a severe competition, and we need to, that performance indicator we were talking about, we have to really upgrade the performance, the productivity per unit of water committed. So the irrigation service delivery models, I see here, there are 3 models here. They are all interconnected. You have the public-led, I know you know that, the farmer-led, and then the NGO-led. We have IDE. This morning, I don't know if there is IDE here, but I saw them here. There is Kickstart. Those are NGO-led, and they have also space in this. We cannot discount that. They are actually distributing a lot of technologies, and they are engaging farmers. And the public-led is there. So the case for irrigation is still valid, right? We need to feed a lot of people, but not only feeding in a much more sustainable way, in a much more sustainable way, and also in a resilient way. Historically, in the bank, the irrigation portfolio used to be high. For some reason, for a valid reason, there was some decline again in the investment. Basically because of environmental lobby. There was a huge environmental movement, so the bank took the pedal off their feet, and now we are re-engaging, right? We are re-engaging, but when we are re-engaging, we have to be looking at it very critically in a way that does not disturb the environment, in a way that's socially acceptable. So what is really farmer-led irrigation development? We talked about it, So this is also a definition that was provided back in 2018, the Global Food and Water Conference in DC, that was co-organized by USAID and also Doherty Water and Food Global Institute and the World Bank. So it's basically a process in which farmers, individual and or in group, drive establishment, improvement, and expansion of irrigated agriculture, often in interaction with other actors. So there is no, we should not trivialize that when we say farmer-led irrigation, there is no scope for public engagement. The public's role, a big role. Even the NGOs play a big role. And also, the farmer-led irrigation concept also equally applies to the improvement of existing irrigation schemes. As you have seen from the Georgia case, a lot of irrigation systems are really performing at a very low productivity level and efficiency level. And if I may give you an example, in Turkey, one of the major engagement in irrigation sector is modernization. Actually, it is total modernization, converting the irrigation systems into water supply and sanitation systems. It's all piping from intake down to the tertiary level, and then metering it, and the farmers are paying for it. It's on-demand delivery, and that ensures you can also apply policy incentives for that. So the farmer-led irrigation concept can actually apply to that situation, to valorization of existing and poor-performing irrigation systems. So the rationale for promoting farmer-led irrigation improves access to irrigation. It's cheaper, relatively cheaper. In many situations, it's cheaper and also quicker. When you talked about the developing a new irrigation system, I think you have to plan it very well. You have to study the hydrology, the suitability of the land, the soil, and the quality of water. Those are involved in it, and implementation is also very difficult. It takes a lot of, I'm involved in a few of them, and it takes many years, 7, 8. So it's quicker. And also it improves climate resilience, that is known. Climate resilience, people talk about adaptation actually, right? It's not just adaptation actually. Do you know the amount of energy involved in withdrawing water and moving it around to the farm gate? It's a huge, and there is energy implied in that, right? And that, if that energy is the dirty one, the carbon-based one, it is potentially contributing to the CO2, right? So when you convert that into a clean energy, then there is a scope for actually mitigation contribution. Leverage public finances, so that is also very visible because the farmers are shouldering the financing of the activity, so it helps the public to be to shoulder the it has less impact on the physical situation. Enhances rural employment. That's also, when we're talking about irrigation, one of the virtues of the irrigation is that it's not just at the primary level. Look a village where there is a thriving irrigation. You see a lot of communication, telephone communication, transportation, and food processing, women marketers. So all those are enhanced there. So. And it's also inclusive, particularly for this kind of individualized irrigation systems. The young people are much more interested in it because they control their effort and they also reap their output. And also you can now irrigate, reach out marginal areas. Okay, and so now I would like to give you an example of the farmer-led irrigation. There is, in the European Union, there is what they call pre-accession assistance for rural development. What it is if a country is nominated to be part of the European Union, there are some sectoral alignments that should be done. For example, there are some standards. And so they have developed a program that is provided to these candidate countries to align their sectors to the European standard, right? So one of the areas where they do is agriculture, rural development. And so they have a grant fund that they are providing to these countries. And these countries also, they put their own they contribute to the pot, and they lend to it's a grant funding to the farmers to get access to irrigation, to mechanization, and a lot of that. So in this process, you see, for example, the one you see over there is actually it's a drip irrigation that is financed through this EPART program. It's a private farmer, and you can see this greenhouses, all sorts of these kinds of things are going on. So. Yeah. So in the Western Balkan, for example, now, and Croatia, about 54% of all irrigating farms have private irrigation facilities, and about 90% of which are using groundwater, the usual suspect. So groundwater is amenable to these private initiatives, right? So the financing is EU EPARD, government EPARD-like programs, their own, and own saving also. You can see some of the examples of the things going. And this is one example from Serbia. You saw the drilling rig there, and so they produce they drill wells at a cost, the borehole about 1,500 euro. But what I would like to show you there is the total cost. Not only drilling, but the entire setup, including the fertigation and everything, is 3,200 euro per hectare, which is much lower than the one in Africa. So that's the paradox now. If we want this practice to take off in Africa, we have to solve this kind of differences that we have. Okay, so in the future, what is the future outlook for farmer-led irrigation? I told already you about the valorization of existing public irrigation systems. Actually, we can adopt the farmer-led irrigation concept there. Need to have a dedicated fleet national program, similar to EU part. I think I liked the EU program, the Western Balkan program. I think if we manage to persuade African governments to have a program of such a program, then it is very easy to finance them. You know, they can approach bilateral financing support, or from us, from the World Bank, from African Development Bank. But there is a need for a program of that sort. Murray is not here. I think we will be discussing about that. And also, fleet has an application in fragile and conflict-affected areas, you know, particularly around refugees. Because the infrastructure involved is not really great, you can respond handily to emergency situations. So we have some programs in Somalia, for example, in northern Uganda for South African refugees. And in the future, then we have to focus also on the resource sustainability. That's all from my side. Thank you very much. And you will be hearing from our experience, actual practical experience, in the next video. No?
Exactly. Thank you so much, Regasa. Now we're going to have a video from Gabriela Izzi sharing the experience from Africa, so how it's working on the ground.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabriela Izzi. I'm a senior irrigation specialist at the World Bank, and I'm very pleased to be with you today. Today, I'm going to talk about the role of governments in catalyzing farmers' action in irrigation. You just heard from my colleague Regasa of the experience from Eastern Europe. My presentation is going to be focused on Africa. So when we talk about farmer-led irrigation in general, and as Regasa has just presented, we are focusing on a farmer-led process, meaning that the farmer by himself or herself should be able to interact with the other private sector actors to develop irrigation. So a farmer should be able to reach out to irrigation equipment suppliers, with value chain actors to sell the irrigation production. So when we think about the role of government in fleet, it might seem rather limited because the government might be actually limited to a regulatory role. For example, the government might require a farmer to get a water abstraction permit in order to develop irrigation, but it might be it. But again, this is theory. Much different is the reality of farmers across Africa when it comes to irrigation development. And those many real different that can be the role of government in catalyzing this process. So what's specific to Africa when it comes to irrigation development? First of all, I would say the ambitious goals that governments all across Africa are setting up in terms of irrigation expansion. I'm putting here a graphic on the situation in Kenya, but same can be said about so many other countries. Kenya would like to develop 1.2 million hectares of irrigated land by 2030, which means, as you can see from the green line, that Kenya would like to increase its irrigated area by 40,000 hectares every year. The red line is the reality. You can see that the irrigation expansion is going much slower than what's supposed to be, and it would need an increase by 4 times in order to reach the annual target, and by 10 times in order to increase in order to reach the 2030 final target. Another truth when it comes to irrigation expansion in Africa is the fact that Africa still has a lot of natural resource potential. We don't know exactly how much irrigation is going on in Africa in total, but what we know is that a good 20 million hectares of irrigated land could still be developed. Now the question is, with what money? And in how much time? And this is why FLID is actually so interested in for governments across Africa. It can actually help a lot in filling the gap when it comes to irrigation expansion. The third element to keep in mind as we think about irrigation development in Africa is the fact that irrigation expansion will happen mostly among smallholder farmers. In Africa, we have 33 plus million smallholder farmers. And so the question is how government can catalyze their action in irrigation so to reach the ambitious goals in terms of irrigation expansion. So here I have the picture of one farmer, Miss Alice from Uganda, and we can look at the situation of Miss Alice as an example of of the situation that many smallholder farmers are going through in across the continent. So she is in a rural area in Uganda, and more specifically, she's about 8 hours away from the capital of Kampala, and 2.5 hours, more or less, when it doesn't rain, from the main town of Mbarara. She has just 1 hectare of land she's renting, and she's very keen to develop irrigation. Now, if we look at her situation, the interaction with other private sector actors is not as smooth as it could be in theory. So when she tries to reach out to irrigation equipment suppliers, she does not present a very strong business case. An irrigation equipment supplier wouldn't need to travel 8 hours from Kampala or 2.5 hours from Mbarara just to check whether she has a viable water source, and just to check if she could technically develop irrigation. And even if she could, she doesn't represent a strong business case because it's just 1 hectare. Plus, she might not be able to raise the money to pay the irrigation equipment supplier because she's not credit-worthy vis-a-vis a financial institution. She doesn't have any land tenure document, and she doesn't have, more likely, any strong tie with a value chain actor which can vouch for her vis-a-vis the financial institutions. So she's actually not able to develop irrigation by herself. And this is where the role of the government can come in. So the government of Uganda, through the microscale irrigation program, is trying to catalyze farmers' action in irrigation by creating a more conducive environment around the smallholder farmers like Miss Alice. And I give you some example of what the program is doing. First of all, the microscale irrigation program is trying to demonstrate to private sector actors that there is an economy of scale of engaging with Miss Alice. And this is because it's not only Miss Alice that has 1 hectare and wants to develop irrigation, but there are actually many more smallholder farmers in the district, in the region, and countrywide. So there is actually a very strong business case for irrigation equipment suppliers, financing institutions, value chain actors to look at this segment of farmers. And indeed, this economy of scale is what can also facilitate the smallholder farmers' access to credit. So what the microscale irrigation program is doing is trying to give to financing institutions the information about what irrigation is, what smallholder farmers can gain from irrigation, as well as the overall business case of providing loans to these kind of farmers. And indeed, we are not thinking about the single loan to Miss Alice, but we are thinking about the 90 billion Uganda shillings that can represent the business case for financing institutions open to link with these segments of farmers. The other thing that the micro-scale irrigation program is doing is reducing transactions costs for irrigation equipment suppliers. We say that an irrigation equipment supplier might not be interested in traveling 8 hours from Kampala to Misales, or 2.5 hours from Barara to Misales, because just to check about the viability of the water source, and not even knowing if they are going to get a contract or not. So what the government of Uganda is doing is through the Ministry of Agriculture and through the local government is carrying out the farm visits, so that the about $70 that each farm visit costs doesn't wait on the irrigation equipment supplier, but rather on the government. This way, the government can check whether the specific farmers has the technical requirements to develop irrigation, and at that point present that business case to irrigation equipment suppliers. Another element that the micro-scale irrigation program is investing on is increasing affordability for smallholder farmers to purchase the irrigation equipment. We know that Miss Alice might be able to get a loan, but she might not be able to cover the whole $6,000 that such an irrigation equipment costs. So the government is providing a partial grant, and the farmer is paying the rest. On average, we are seeing that out of the $6,000 per irrigation equipment, the government covers about $4,000. The farmers covers about $2,000. So 2 years into the implementation of this program, what have we seen? We have seen that 40,000 smallholder farmers have joined. This again is to demonstrate the fact that smallholder farmers can represent a business case when the overall numbers is actually considered. Second, we have seen that local government staff have carried out more than 10,000 farm visits. Again, the objective here is to reduce the transaction costs for the private sector to carry out those farm visits and confirm the technical viability of developing irrigation. 3,300 tenders have been advertised. And why it's important? It's because advertising tenders for farmers in the same districts create that business case for irrigation equipment suppliers, not only to bid and provide that equipment to smallholder farmers, but also to maybe open up new branches in districts where a lot of smallholder farmers are requesting for irrigation. Another element very interesting is the fact that so far $2.5 million have been raised in farmers' co-payments. Farmers have not been handed over an irrigation equipment, they have paid partially for their irrigation equipment. And 2 years into the micro-scale irrigation program, already 1,000 plus farmers are irrigating, making it a reality for FLID to provide irrigation to farmers in much shorter time than traditional irrigation development. The World Bank is supporting governments all across Africa, catalyzing FLID. So Uganda is just one of many examples. So far, we are supporting 13 countries across Africa in projects and programs catalyzing FLID. We have in our portfolio $430 million that have been earmarked for FLID. And this is going to correspond to a leveraging of at least $65 million of farmers' money. All this is expected to translate in 185,000 farmers, particularly smallholder farmers, accessing irrigation. Last words. if I can leave you with three elements to keep in mind as you think about government catalyzing FLIT across Africa, there are three elements I would like you to retain. First of all, work at scale. As much as we're talking about smallholder farmers or across Africa, overall, there is a huge business case. So it's very important not to work at pilot level, but at scale. Second element to keep in mind is temporary involvement for governments. Again, governments are there to catalyze a process, not to take the place of farmers when it comes to irrigation development. So government's role needs to be set in time and should evolve over time, which brings me to my last point: reassess frequently the projects and programs that are catalyzing FLIT so that the government's role can be focused on the elements that are the major bottlenecks for farmers in a specific region and in a specific time. And with this, I thank you very much, and I look forward to keep working with all of you when it comes to farmer-led irrigation development. Thank you.
So now, Nick, you have 8 minutes to reflect on all of it.
Thank you, Mon. And I'd like to acknowledge the kind invitation from the World Bank for this. So I'm the tail ender in this session. So that means I have less time. And that means that I have to put more meaning into every word, right, to offer the same value as the previous speaker. So I will try to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit, my goal is to reflect a little bit on both parts of what we've heard so far, both on the performance assessment and then on the farmer-led irrigation. And I just have a couple of points on each, and I will be done in, I think, 7 minutes now is what I have left. So let me start by saying, first of all, I'm actually a huge believer in performance assessment and also in the role of remote sensing in benchmarking and performance assessment. Likewise, I'm a huge believer in farmer-led irrigation as an approach to reach scale quickly. So my comments are of the yes and variety rather than criticisms. They're comments that say these are tools and approaches and frameworks that have a lot of potential. And we might ask these kinds of questions as we roll them out to scale to see what we can learn from that. So I really like that several of the speakers, and Gabriella, just at the very end of her talk, really talked about scale. And that's actually something that's come across as a theme throughout the 2 days of this conference. It's critical for us to understand irrigation behavior at scale and quickly, and to think about how we operate at scale. And in a Global South setting, really, there's a lot we don't know about irrigation behavior. So on a very basic level, we need to know who, what, when, where, and why. Now, I'll say there's a lot in the Global South we don't know. That's also true in the US, and it's true in Australia and so on. So we know less about irrigation than we think we know, and that makes understanding the environmental impacts, the economic impacts, and the efficiency of schemes rather hard. So my first comments are going to be, let's see if I can make this work. Oh, there we go. So my first comments are going to be around performance assessment and remote sensing. One of the challenges, as Poulad laid out in performance assessment, is that we use remote sensing in part because we don't have any ground truth. And so that requires a leap of faith that the remote sensing is capturing something that is meaningful, and that variability in the remote sensing data is meaningful on the ground. Now, we're very fortunate, and I'm going to bridge to a US setting to make a point. So here and there, we're very lucky in that we have settings where we can provide both remote sensing and ground truth data at scale. So this is a study that we did in the Institute in 2019. Christopher Neal and his team were also involved in this study. And what we have here is some data from 2000 to 2012 from western Nebraska, where each data point here is flow meter. So it's totalizing flow meter data for one groundwater fed well, one field. And we have about 9,200 field year data points. where on the horizontal axis you have the remotely sensed modeled irrigation, and on the vertical axis you have the actual observed irrigation of the flow through the flow meter. And so that lets us see, these are all center pivots, they're all irrigating corn, they're all the same size. So we've actually not used a lot of data to try to standardize the analysis. And there are a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, on some level, yeah, it's a pretty good match, right? The black 45-degree line is the one-to-one line. So it's a pretty good match. The red line, which has a slope less than 1, is the lowest fit. So it's the mean. And actually, what that's showing us is that we can interpret that as there being a tendency to over-irrigate in wet years and deficit irrigate in dry years. So in other words, we could interpret that as a behavioral response to drought that we're seeing. And that matches what we see on the ground. But I'd also point out that the variability in the data is rather large. So if you were to say, what is the uncertainty associated with remote sensing estimates, you might say 5% or 10% or 20%, but certainly in some cases it can be much more. And so I point this out for the following reason, and this is my next slide. This was a follow-on paper. So remote sensing data is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful and absolutely has a place globally. One of the questions that we should ask is, what are we doing with the remote sensing data? And how sensitive are the things that we're doing to measurement error, model error, other kinds of uncertainty? And some of the things we care about actually are not very sensitive to uncertainty. So for example, basin scale water balance. Remote sensing is fantastic for that. And if you have mean zero error in the remote sensing estimate, it passes all the way through and there's no problem. However, there are other things such as crop yields and welfare and profits where uncertainty propagates differently because of the underlying nonlinearity in the crop water production functions, let alone the stochastic nature of the crop water production functions, which is another thing. It's a basic economic result, and basically we have this modeled using a similar crop water production to what we had in the previous slide, which is irrigated corn. On the horizontal axis here, you have the standard deviation of error of estimates, so whether it's remote sensing or something else. If you have an error in the estimate of how much water you actually feed into your crop water production function, then you have a welfare loss associated with it. And that welfare loss can get quite large. And so the point here is that depending on what you care about, and even if you have mean zero or white noise in terms of how your uncertainty enters into your system, for some of the things you care about, such as estimates of crop yield, estimates of profit, or the impacts of policy on water users at a field level, you're going to have, in some cases, rather large impacts. And so that's just one thing you have to bear in mind. Now, let's see. I want to jump now up to farmer-led irrigation. And one of my tasks is to try to bridge between the two parts of the talk, which I think are actually much more related than we might think. So when we look at the future of irrigation in the Global South, much of it has key roles for the private sector. And one of the challenges of farmer-led irrigation is building distribution networks to sell irrigation equipment to individual farmers is very, very hard. On top of that, as Ragasa pointed out, you have to deal with financial issues. And as Gabriella pointed out, you also have to deal with agronomic support and technical support, and there are very large transaction costs associated with that. If you succeed, right, so if you actually succeed in scaling with smallholder irrigation, you then have a governance issue in that suddenly you have hundreds of thousands or millions of pumps that are individually owned and operated with very little control over what's happening in the landscape. And some of the issues we see somewhere in, for instance, we might say in India, are related to this issue that you've succeeded in scaling smallholder irrigation, and now you've built in a governance issue. And so the thought I want to leave you with is this, and I actually really liked, I wrote down exactly how Isbrand said it, that working at a larger scale, the bank is experimenting with outsourcing irrigation service to third-party operators based on irrigation performance assessment. That's a very, very well incentive-aligned system that the irrigation operator gets payments, and those payments are more or less based on whether you meet performance criteria. And effectively, that has a governance system built in. It works at a scale of a few thousand hectares. And so my question is, could that not work at a much smaller scale? So one of the pieces of farmer-led irrigation that is our starting point is that the end point of farmer-led irrigation is that every farmer will own their own pump. That's one end point. It's not the only end point. Another end point is also to think about irrigation service delivery contracts in a farmer-led irrigation setting where you have performance assessment and where payments are based on the amount of water going through, delivered, and the performance criteria and crop yields. And it may be, or at least I'd hypothesize, that in settings of a few hundred hectares where you have irrigation service providers, actually ground truthing data may be easier than at the few thousand hectare scale. Because putting a GPS on a cell phone is free, it's there already, and putting a flow meter on a pump is very, very cheap. And so I might say that the same kinds of tools and techniques that we're seeing at a larger scale, in conjunction with some of the remote sensing assessment, but some of those tools may fit very well into a small scale. And so it's a different way of slicing the pie to provide access at scale. So with that, I think I'm actually 3 minutes over. My apologies, Amal. Thank you very much.
Now, thank you very much, and we're closing this session. Thanks for everyone, and we're available if you want more discussion in the break and at the closing of the event. Thank you.